Hello and welcome to the NBA Outlet presented by OTGBasketball.com. Make sure you follow OTG on Twitter at OTGBasketball. Also hit that subscribe button. I'm your host, Nick Fay. With me, OTG's Kory Waldron and Matt Chin. What's up, fellas?
Yo, what's going on, guys? Happy to be here. Excited to talk little Raptors basketball.
We can't even go a full pod. We're going to have to mention Drake at least twice throughout this podcast, right?
Yeah, no, I sent him an email to see if he wanted to do the pod, but I didn't get a response.
Oh, loser.
I know. Come on. But, talking about the North, the Raptors, we're in the top 10 now. Raptors are coming in at number 9. Before we talk about that ranking, let's talk about the team from last season. Another 50-win season, but another disappointing playoffs. What are your thoughts on the Raptors from last year?
Yeah, I'll go first. Another 51 season, like you said, second one in franchise history. The Raptors 6th in offensive rating, 11th in defensive rating in the regular season. So definitely one of the hardest outs in the Eastern Conference. I thought Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan just had fantastic years. Per usual, I thought the Raptors were one of the toughest teams to scheme against in the regular season. But as you mentioned, Nick, really tough playoff run for them once again. After going all in at the trade deadline, they were 14th out of 16 teams in offensive efficiency in the playoffs, and that's kind of been the story with Toronto and how they finished their seasons the last couple of years.
They're a joke when it comes to playoff time. I mean, if you want to be realistic here, this is a team, like you said, Nick, started off every year in the playoffs. We expect high things from, to be the biggest threat to the Cleveland Cavaliers. And it seems every year they come up short. Whether it's between Kyle Lowry always being hurt or DeMar DeRozan struggling as much as they do in the regular season. And we know that DeRozan makes a lot of his points from the free throw line. Getting Serge Ibaka last year, PJ Tucker. They brought in a lot of guys. There was a lot of talk around the trade deadline that this Raptors team was the biggest threat to the Cavs in the East. And when it came down, putting money where your mouth is, they just weren't.
Yeah, you mentioned it. They brought in Serge Ibaka, PJ Tucker. They kind of went in all in for the playoffs. The Cavs look a little bit weaker last year. The defense wasn't looking great, so maybe the Raptors thought they could take a swing at it. But Lowry was hurt in the playoffs, and that's kind of been a theme for them. It feels like going into the playoffs, they're never fully healthy. Obviously, they have struggles, but to top that with a Kyle Lowry injury, it's like they have no chance. Even against the Bucks in the first round, it wasn't necessarily smooth sailing, and then they got swept by Cavs in round 2. What do you think the major issue is for the Raptors in the playoff? Do you think it's their style of basketball? Do you think it's DeRozan and Lowry just choking, or do you think it's just bad luck with injuries?
I think it comes down to a lot of scheme for me. The Raptors are a team I think that's really difficult to scheme for in the regular season because they have such good isolation players in their backcourt, but you put them in a 7-game series and Lowry and DeRozan only have so much creativity before it's a lot easier to kind of plan and scheme for them. In the playoffs, I think they try to get a little bit more creative, but the most that Dwayne Casey really does is, give one guy an opportunity to play pick and run or pick and roll, then the next guy gets an opportunity to run pick and roll. And that's just not going to cut it, especially when you don't have the floor spacing, the ball movement that some of these top tier echelon teams have.
I had a weird stat brought up. It was the playoffs per game. The playoffs per game, DeMar DeRozan last year averaged 22.4 points per game. If you look at that per 36 minutes, he averaged less points per game, which I just find funny. But he's just DeRozan for me is just very ineffective in the playoffs because Matt, like you mentioned, the game plans change, and I think because so many people know that the focal point of the Raptors is obviously around Kyle Lowry and DeRozan. And when Lowry's, like you mentioned, Nick, and we're mentioning it again, he's constantly hurt. It's easier to focus all your attention on DeMar DeRozan, who is, at this point in time, the best player on the Toronto Raptors, in my opinion. I think he's not head and shoulders better than Kyle Lowry, but he can just do more than Kyle Lowry can do at this point in his career.
Let's talk highlight of the Raptors season. What was the biggest highlight for you last year for this team?
From a player perspective, DeMar DeRozan, coming off of an Olympic gold medal, he just had a fantastic offensive output season. I mean, defensively, he's still a bit of a question mark on that end of the floor, but offensively, just absolutely spectacular. Scored 30 points in the first 5 games in the season, first player since Michael Jordan to do that. He did that in 1987. DeRozan at 27 points a game, just over 35 minutes per game. I thought he was absolutely fantastic, excluding the playoffs.
Yeah, I'm rolling with Matt as well with DeRozan. I think DeRozan stood out in almost every category. Obviously, he had his best season yet in the NBA, raising his points per game from 23 to 27. I mean, to start off the year, that guy was on an absolute tear too, if I recall correctly. He came out of the gates on fire. I think at one point he was the highest scorer in the league for a couple weeks. But season cooled down and playoffs came around, and the same old Raptors showed their head.
Yeah, I think DeRozan's kind of the easy choice here, like you guys mentioned. Like Matt said, the first 5 games scoring over 30 points, first guy to do it since MJ. Obviously, if you do that, that's a big deal. He had to carry this team at points too because Lowry was dealing with injury once again, and DeRozan was kind of that constant guy. Obviously, in the playoffs, it was rough, but regular season-wise, he made a lot of improvements, and he constantly improved his game. So this year, there's been talk about him maybe adding a 3-point shot, doing a little bit more pick-and-roll ball handling. So another interesting season for him. But let's talk disappointment.
Wait, can I add one more other kind of out of the box highlight here? So this one actually happened after the season. I thought the fact that Masai Ujiri, their GM, not ditching them to go to New York was a really significant development that wasn't spoken of. The Knicks, after they fired Phil, were hot on the tails for Ujiri, who's done such a great job in Toronto. And I think, if that same offer happened maybe 10, 15 years ago, any GM in the league would jump at the opportunity to run the Knicks, a team that's in the mecca of basketball, will pay high into the luxury tax. So I think it's a testament to how far Toronto has come as a franchise. They're finally, kind of a franchise that's on the map now. And I think keeping Masai Ujiri and, allowing him to continue the development north of the border is a really, really big deal for them.
The culture in Toronto within the last probably 3 to 5 years, since they went to this, DeMar DeRozan, Kyle Lowry, being the face of the franchise, since Drake has been the ambassador of the Raptors. I mean, the culture in Toronto is real. I mean, they've built a winning culture. I mean, obviously, it hasn't translated to titles or extremely deep playoff runs, but that's a part of what the GM has done and everything else. They've really built a successful team to this point in time.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the culture has really changed. Even the fan base has gotten better. And, Toronto's becoming one of the harder places to play in the NBA. So you got to give him a lot of props. And like you said, Matt, losing him would have been a big hamper to this culture and this organization. So keeping him is a big deal, especially when a team, like you said, the Knicks, they're not as hot as they used to be, but they still have some pop being in New York, MSG. It's still a big deal. But let's talk disappointment. Biggest disappointment for the Raptors last year.
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit, just not being able to translate the same success in the playoffs. This has been something that's been an ongoing issue for Toronto the last couple of years, and it just gets added on to when you take into consideration that they went all in at the trade deadline. I really loved the addition of PJ Tucker and Serge Ibaka for that matter. I mean, I feel differently about Ibaka's contract, but adding him at the deadline, I thought those were great additions for Toronto, and just after taking the Cavs to a pretty good fight in the playoffs the year before, just not being able to translate it this year was a huge disappointment for them.
Yeah, I'm not gonna pick out the disappointment of them being failing in the playoffs. I'm gonna pick Valanciunas. I mean, this was a guy who we saw getting slightly better last year. He was becoming more of an offensive threat for them, and last year, there was just no improvement. He almost played himself out of the rotation pretty much in the playoffs because of how bad he is on defense. He was only playing 22 minutes per game in the playoffs, and that's your starting center who you're paying money to be there on the floor, and he just hasn't been able to produce like we thought he would, or at least I thought he would. Because this is a guy who's
I just don't think he's playable.
Gifted. No, he isn't. At this point in his career, he's not. He's too slow.
Yeah, and in a playoff series, it's just too easy to get him in a switch with a pick-and-roll ball handler. And then once you get him on an island, he's toast. So, I mean, guys like that, him, Enes Kanter, you can't play those guys in the playoffs anymore.
Oh, they're flat-footed.
Yeah. Exactly. And, I think you both made great picks. The injuries obviously suck for the Raptors. It seems like every year somebody's banged up, especially Lowry. And then, like you said, Valanciunas, he didn't really take another step in his game. His minutes were down. His points were down a little bit. It's like, you expect him to be better, especially when Lowry is out and they really needed him. And then playing with other good players should have helped him, but he kind of just regressed. You know what I mean? So it's kind of there's been talk, I think, this summer that the Raptors were trying to move him and they weren't even able to unload the contract just because no one has interest in a player like that. Like you mentioned, Matt, some of these bigs that can only score on offense and can't defend a pick and roll aren't really playable.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could throw him out there sometimes, like against like small lineups where the center isn't someone who's like much of a facilitator. Then you can have Valanciunas on the glass just abusing people. Like I know that they used Valanciunas a lot against like Kelly Olynyk last year, and when you have those kinds of matchups where you have a weak defender or a weak rebounding team, then you can like deploy Valanciunas in some 5 or 6 minute spurts to grab you a couple boards and really close down the paint. But overall, I think players like him are just becoming more obsolete in the league.
Exactly, especially in a 7-game series. In the regular season, like you said, you can kind of find them some more minutes, but in the playoffs, it's a lot harder, especially when they're scheming against him. But let's talk about this rank. The Raptors being the first team inside our top 10 at number 9. What are your thoughts on them? Too high, too low, fair?
It's pretty fair to me. I had them in front of the Bucks anyway, who was one ranking behind on our podcast or on our author rankings. So overall, to me, it's a fair ranking. I think eventually they will take a step back from where they were last year, but I still consider them to be a top 4 seed overall in the East.
Yeah, I agree. It's fair. They're right on this cusp between 11, 10, and 9. 9 is fair, especially coming off a 51-win season. This is a team that every year is in the top part of the East. And with the East getting worse, they're not going to move much.
Yeah, I agree. I think, they've kind of earned the respect to be in that top 10 until proven otherwise. And the East, like we mentioned on a lot of these pods, is going to be pretty bad this year. And the Raptors will be one team that have some good players and they can take advantage of those easy wins. But let's talk additions. Draft-wise, they drafted OG Anunoby. This guy's going to bring a lot of perimeter defense, some real toughness. Offensively, he needs to add to his game. But what do you guys like about him for Toronto?
Yeah, Anunoby, and he's not practicing right now in training camp because he's still recovering from a knee injury. But I thought where they got him in the later part of the first round was a good pick for them. They really needed some versatility on the wing. And Anunoby was one of my favorite kind of switchable, versatile wing products coming out of college. He has a good willingness to defend, get his nose dirty. He has a 7'6" wingspan, good NBA ready body. He can put the ball on the floor a little bit and finish. He's still pretty raw offensively, but overall, he's just an incredible athlete, good rebounder. I think he has the makings to be a really solid 3-and-D role player.
OG. I like this kid a lot. I mean, obviously, he played at IU, Indiana University, which is close to me since I'm from Indiana. Like you said, Matt, though, you pretty much hit, you're spot on. He's going to be a solid 3-and-D guy. I'm not sure where he'll develop in terms of being a role player or a starter. The one issue with the, Toronto Raptors these last, 3 to 5 years has been their lack of a small forward. No offense to new net, Damari Carroll. But, they've been lacking in that 3 spot. So they definitely need someone. And obviously, they got C.J. Miles to talk about. And they have Norman Powell coming up who's, shown glimpses of being something very good. But, OG, depending on how he comes back from the knee injury, depending on how he fits in, how many minutes he can get on a team that's, competing in the East, he could definitely have a nice career up north in Toronto.
Yeah, the Raptors quietly have done a pretty good job grabbing some young guys with a little bit of upside, even though they've been a good team, which is kind of smart, and it kind of gives them a little bit more potential moving forward with their bench. It's a risk always playing young guys, but it could work out, especially if he comes back healthy. Like you said, Matt, the injury, it kind of gave him a chance to grab a guy a little bit later in the draft than they would have, necessarily.
Just the one thing that kind of scares me off from Anunoby, and I really do love him. He was, toward the top of my rankings in terms of, people who had translatable NBA games. He's marketed as a 3-and-D player, but he shot 56% from the free throw line in college. And I don't know if you guys adhere to the whole theory of free throw percentage translating to developing a good three-point percentage in the NBA. I know there's a fair number of NBA writers and analysts who do adhere to that, but if that's the case, then Anunoby has a really long way to go shooting from distance.
That definitely does have an impact, but I also believe with the way the NBA is going and, all the types of coaches and analytics they have, they'll be able to determine if he can end up being able to shoot or if it's kind of a waste of time. I think the Raptors are kind of willing to bet on him. They probably saw something that they like. And even if, maybe he's only a defensive type player, he can always be a bench guy because you always need one of those dudes to lock somebody down on the perimeter. But you mentioned it earlier, guys, they re-signed Serge Ibaka and Kyle Lowry. Both these guys were brought back. The Raptors are taking another swing at it. We don't necessarily think they're a championship team, but what are your thoughts on bringing back these two and competing for another top seed in the East?
Yeah, I mean, they're just they're kind of running it back here with the same core that they've been rolling with. And it was a lot of money for Ibaka. I thought Lowry played admirably in a tough point guard market. He did well to do $100 million over 3 years. The thing I do like about the combination of the contracts is that they're both 3-year deals, so they run out at the same time. So if Toronto wants to keep rolling it back with this same core the next couple of years and they realize that it's not going to work out, they can go in a different direction at the same time with Lowry and Ibaka. I preferred the Patrick Patterson contract, and we'll get to that in the departure section, to the Ibaka contract. But overall, I don't think there's anything wrong with Toronto running back the same core that they've had coming off 2 50-win seasons. There's absolutely nothing wrong with getting back to the second round, maybe an Eastern Conference Finals. I mean, they don't have the ceiling of a finals team, but it's still really exciting to have a 50-win-plus team to root for on a nightly basis.
I'm so on the fence about this. Realistically, it's the smart thing to do, because if you lose Serge Ibaka, if you lose Kyle Lowry, if you don't pay these two guys, what is your team? You're in the bottom half of the East, fighting for an 8th seed with how bad the East is. You obviously had to pay those two. I'm not, like you said, Matt, it is, they're 3-year deals, so it's not like this is going to hurt them long term. And by the time these guys, Lowry will be 34, Ibaka will be 31. So when the contracts run out, they're getting rid of those guys, while they're on that decline. I just hate the fact that they're going to be paying, Lowry $33 million his final year, Ibaka $23 million, DeRozan $27 million, Valanciunas $17 million. It's a lot of cap locked up between 4 guys. And who knows how much of a beating Lowry would have taken by that final year of that contract. What will Valanciunas be in another 3 years? Same thing with Ibaka. I mean, you had to bring it back for the short term. I'm just worried about the end of these guys, contracts.
Yeah, the Raptors. The Raptors were stuck in like a tough spot. If they didn't re-sign these guys, like you said, Kory, they'd kind of be a mediocre type team. And, they're not going to compete. They're not going to get a high pick, so they're not really going to get much better. They're not bad enough to tank, and they're not good enough to win a championship. Like you said, Matt, maybe they get lucky, another Eastern Conference Finals appearance. That's not bad. And, another 50-win season would not be a bad thing either. It's kind of just establishing the winning culture in Toronto. Just constantly winning does help the franchise. So I think the Raptors ultimately made a good decision. I think, going forward, we could see expiring contracts have a little bit more value with the cap kind of getting stagnant in the future. So maybe moving a Lowry at the end of his deal or Serge Ibaka might work out for them and kind of open up some space and allow them to grab somebody.
If someone wants to take a $33 million, 34-year-old Kyle Lowry, God bless him.
Well, on an expiring deal, like think about a situation like the Lakers where you're looking to get a max free agent the following year, but you need contracts off the books. That's something you might think about. You wouldn't be a move to win for that season, but it'd be a move to win in the offseason.
It's just so much money just to even have on the books. But like you said, if it's an expiring deal, it doesn't hurt anyone, obviously.
And the side effects of having those 2 massive deals is that it really cut into re-signing some of the role players. Without getting too much into it, the Patrick Pattersons, the PJ Tucker, Kory Joseph, letting go of Damari Carroll. I mean, using all of that cap space on Ibaka and Lowry had those residual effects of losing those guys. So it, logistically, it means that the younger players at the end of the bench, your Norman Powell's, Pascal Siakam, Bebe Nojera, those are guys that are going to have significantly more minutes. And it's to be seen whether or not they're going to be able to handle all those bulk minutes on a team that's still trying to compete for an Eastern Conference championship.
definitely a lot on the young guys, but let's talk about the one move they did make in terms of trading. They picked up CJ Miles from the Pacers. They sent over Kory Joseph. What are your thoughts on CJ Miles? He's going to provide them some nice 3-point shooting.
Yeah, as I pointed out before, I thought their biggest void for them in the playoffs was their floor spacing, and CJ Miles is certainly someone who's a three-point specialist, can light it up from any sort of distance. He fits pretty seamlessly in any scheme. He's not a huge usage rate guy, so his off-ball game will be really heavily utilized. I like the deal. I like the fit. My biggest question with him is he's 6'6", but he's not super strong or super athletic. I prefer him guarding twos, and I think with Lowry and DeRozan, they'll probably want him guarding threes, which is a job that's probably better suited for Norman Powell because he has that extra length and that extra athleticism that Miles doesn't have. So it'll be an interesting battle between Powell and Miles throughout the season to see who takes the full-time small forward job.
Man, I love CJ Miles. I mean, obviously coming from the Pacers, I've watched him play a lot for the last 3 years. I saw throw out a couple stats. His usage rate last year tied his career low in 18.4, but he had his career high in shooting percentage. He had his career high in 3-point percentage, and his second highest ever field goal percentage. I mean, that's really good. We saw usage drop by almost 2 points, and he still remained 4 points, and he still remained a consistent, accurate shooter. The only bad thing about CJ Miles is he is very streaky. There can be a stretch of like 7 games where CJ Miles will hit, 3 to 5 threes in a game. And then there'll be another stretch within, right after that hot streak where for 10 games, this guy can't hit the broadside of a barn. That's the only bad thing about getting him. But, when you have DeMarre Carroll, who, for, all intents and purposes was a train wreck his time in Toronto. He never really regained the knee strength or whatever. He just didn't look good on the floor. CJ Miles will definitely add, like you said, Matt, spacing, which he lacked in the playoffs. And I'm not sure if he starts. I know he's battling Norman Powell for that starting small forward spot. And when we talk about lines, we'll talk about that as well. But, this is a guy who will definitely add 3-point shooting to a team that desperately needs it.
Yeah, he's a good fit with Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan. Like you guys mentioned, the spacing is something. When you have guys like to drive to the rim and get inside the paint, they need somebody to kick it to in the corner. CJ Miles can be that guy. Like you mentioned, Kory, he is a little bit streaky. I know FanDuel-wise, I pick him up sometimes. He give me, under 10 points. In other games, he might hit, like you said, 4 or 5 threes. So kind of something to keep an eye on. But definitely spacing is important for that team. They didn't really sign anybody else. They picked up some G League guys, nothing, very substantial. But let's talk to Departures, like you mentioned, Matt. They lost to DeMarre Carroll. They lost to Kory Joseph, a Patrick Patterson, and a PJ Tucker. Let's start with DeMarre Carroll. Like you guys mentioned, he was terrible in Toronto, never really healthy, and they had to give up a first and second round pick to unload his contract. What are your thoughts on that? And they picked up Justin Hamilton, even though they stretched him. It's only $1 million, I think, for 3 years. It's still something.
Yeah, I disagreed with the principle of the DeMarre Carroll trade. It was obviously a move to get Toronto under the luxury tax threshold. They immediately waived Justin Hamilton after the trade, and then he went on to sign in China. Just to me, Toronto is the 4th biggest TV market in the NBA, according to Nielsen. They're ahead of Boston, they're ahead of Houston, ahead of the Bay Area, all of whom are willing to pay into the luxury tax because their teams are competitive. The Raptors are insanely popular right now. They've been at the top of the Eastern Conference for a few years, and they have deep pockets. They're owned by Maple Leaf Gardens Corporation that owns the Maple Leafs. So to give up both draft picks for next summer just to save a little bit of money, I thought that was not the right decision. I mean, these Raptors fans have been incredibly supportive the last couple of years. This is the highest point where the Raptors have been. And I just thought, on principle, the ownership should have not made this kind of move. I mean, unless they were able to keep their first and second round pick. It just didn't. I just disagreed with the principle of the move. And that's aside from Carroll as a player.
I think the only reason they had to make the move, though, was so they had enough space so they were able to make the trade for CJ Miles. I don't think it was all salary. Like, obviously, they wanted to dump the salary to get under, but I think they also needed to make the move to be able to make the trade for CJ Miles. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I felt like it was a steal for the Nets. I was pretty happy about it.
I mean, it's definitely, I don't want to say, it's definitely painful having to send 2 draft picks with DeMarre Carroll. like you guys just mentioned, they needed to. I'm pretty sure, Nick, you're right, that they needed to loosen up some cap in order to bring in CJ Miles in that sign and trade. And then obviously, of course, they signed Ibaka and Lowry to those huge deals. I think it was more of a money thing, and they really just needed to get this contract off the books. And it was just the fact where, like, the tenure of Carroll on the Raptors was just not good for anyone.
And after he left, he didn't have nice things to say about Toronto. He said, Lowry and DeRozan don't trust anybody and that there's too much iso ball and not enough ball movement. But that's for another day. Kory Joseph, they sent to Indiana. What are your thoughts on losing him?
Yeah, I mean, you never want to give up someone from the graduate school of Greg Popovich basketball. But that's what happens. Sometimes you lose good players like Joseph. He's a professional backup point guard. He's the kind of person that I think, if you want a competitive team that's going to go deep into the playoffs, you want someone like Kory Joseph to be running your second offense. And Joseph was at 25 minutes per game last year, which is a huge chunk. And I do believe in DeLon Wright. I am a believer in him, but I'm not entirely sure that he's ready to take on that kind of workload. And the Raptors would be really smart to manage Kyle Lowry's minutes. So Kory Joseph will be a big loss for them, I think.
I get a ring and I bring it back like Corey Joe. There's the first Drake reference on the podcast. Corey, I'm happy because, the Pacers got Kory Joseph, who, like you just mentioned, Matt, you just made me feel really good about losing CJ Miles for Kory Joseph. He's a fantastic backup point guard. Still very young. He's only 25 years old. And obviously when Lowry went down and missed time last year, Kory Joseph stepped up and played another big role within that, team. They're definitely going to miss Kory Joseph just for the fact that, that it's a backup point guard. The point guard position, like what we say in the NBA, is so important. And say Lowry gets hurt, you don't have a veteran point guard coming in to run the offense. You have to, you rely on Delon Wright. And if he can run an offense by himself if Lowry gets hurt. It raises more question marks if you're losing a guy like Kory Joseph.
Yeah, definitely. And like you guys said, a backup point guard to have around, especially with Lowry's injury history. I mean, the only thing I could think of is I know they've been talking about using DeMar DeRozan more as the primary ball handler. So maybe they're going to stagger Lowry and DeRozan's minutes a little bit more. But let's talk Patrick Patterson. I thought this deal was great for OKC. And I actually was doing some research for the pod, and I also read something that, Patrick Patterson and the Raptors didn't necessarily have a great relationship.
Well, Patrick Patterson is one of my favorite role players in the NBA. I watch a lot of Atlantic Division basketball, and you will not find a bigger Patrick Patterson lover than me. I think he's incredibly versatile, plays the 4 and the 5 on offense, defends 3 4s and 5s on defense, shoots the ball at 37% on 4 attempts per game. And like you said, Nick, such a bargain, 3 years, $16 million. I think I would much rather have that contract than Ibaka's contract and use the leftover money to re-sign PJ Tucker, maybe go after someone like Danilo Gallinari, who would have been really good to space the floor for Toronto. I just love Patrick Patterson's game. He does all the dirty work for you. The Raptors gave up 102 points per 100 possessions with Patterson on the floor, 107 without him, which would have been 18th overall in the NBA. I just think they're going to miss a lot of what Patrick Patterson brings.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. From his time when he played with John Wall and DeMarcus Cousins in Kentucky, I followed Patrick Patterson. He was one of the first guys I can remember being one of those kind of stretch forward guys who would shoot the three. He was kind of doing it right before everyone else, started doing it, across the entire league. For OKC, it was a sweet deal. It looked like he was going to be the starter out there, and obviously he's going to come off the bench now that they got Melo. I like this. I think Toronto for sure. They lost 2 really big role players. I mean, Kory Joseph and Patrick Patterson were essential to that second unit. Patrick Patterson obviously can play some small ball 5, can play 4. And losing a guy like Patterson, you're going to rely more on Serge Ibaka and more on Valanciunas. And, you have this team is going to rely so heavily on rookies this upcoming year and like sophomores. It's kind of scary if you're a team that's fighting in the upper teams in the East. But Patterson's definitely going to be missed along with Kory Joseph.
Yeah, like you said, the rookies and sophomores and even third-year players, it's going to be an interesting year. It gives them some upside, but it also gives them, some risk of being bad as well. But like you guys mentioned, Patterson is a great role player to have around. I think he's definitely like one of these guys we mentioned as a great complementary player because he can help you fill so many different roles. So he's a guy I would always want on my team, and I can definitely see a spot for him on, a contending type team. But, they made the trade for PJ Tucker last year. Now he's no longer there. He's in Houston. What are your thoughts on that?
I thought PJ Tucker was an excellent addition at the trade deadline. Someone who, as a 3-and-D player, fits really well into any sort of system. I thought Tucker was the right choice actually for Cleveland instead of Kyle Korver, just because Tucker provides a lot of grit, a lot of defensive toughness, and he's an excellent three-point shooter. And he reportedly turned down more money to stay in Toronto and decided to go to Houston instead, which I found pretty interesting. But at 32, Tucker has had a long career playing in the NBA and also overseas, so I can see him taking a few steps back. But just another role player that I think down the stretch in the playoffs, when you need that veteran presence, PJ Tucker is someone that you'd rather have on your roster.
I think he just piggybacking off what you just said, I think he'd rather play with the duo of Chris Paul and James Harden, who don't have a problem sharing the ball. If what DeMar Carroll said about, Lowry and DeRozan not trusting anybody, he's going to a team with two guys, the best two players who surely trust their guys around them. They don't care about sharing the rock, even though they get their own points. PJ Tucker, when he was brought in, was labeled the LeBron stopper. He was brought in just to stop LeBron James in the playoffs.
There have been so many people who've been labeled that, and they're just not LeBron's.
It's hilarious. Once a year, every time someone gets moved, a big-time wing defender, it's always, this is the guy. Break LeBron James. PJ Tucker was not that guy, obviously. Like we mentioned, it's funny. All these role players that they lost, it's hard to replace kind of guys who have already paved out their role as role players, and now they're trying to find their next key role players and a bunch of, misfit rookies who haven't proven themselves yet.
Yeah, definitely be interesting here. And like you guys said, there's no such thing as a LeBron stopper. It's just kind of like a myth.
It's honestly just you try to get a lot of people and you throw different looks at him for a couple minutes and hope he misses some shots. Or causes some turnovers. That's really like when people say like, oh, he's a LeBron stopper. I just view it as, someone who's another element to throw at LeBron to give him a different look. But then it takes LeBron 1 or 2 possessions to master it, like the basketball genius he is.
Yeah, they're just players that can make LeBron's life a little bit more difficult, but eventually he's going to make it work. So, but let's talk starters. Not a ton of question marks in the starting lineup, but let's hear what you got.
Yeah, Lowry, DeRozan. I think they start with CJ Miles at the 3, and Norm Powell becomes the full-time 3 by the end of the season. Ibaka, and then unfortunately Valanciunas.
Yeah, I'm rolling with Kyle Lowry, DeMar DeRozan. I think they actually go with Norman Powell to start the season. I think they're going to want the three-point shooting or the consistent three-point shooting. CJ Miles off the bench. And then I think Ibaka and Valanciunas line it up or finish it off.
I'm going to go with Matt's lineup. I think they start with TJ Miles. Like you mentioned, Norman Powell could maybe start, later in the season. But I think Miles, making the trade for him, bringing him in, giving them some real much-needed spacing, especially if they're going to play Valanciunas. One thing I think it would be interesting come playoff time, do you think they could maybe go with a small ball lineup and bench Valanciunas?
Yeah, they have to, but I just don't see who's the stretch 4 that comes in. Like, it's not Norman Powell. He's 6'4". Like, I know he's versatile, but he's not playing the 4. I mean, maybe it's Pascal Siakam, but he's still very young, and I don't know if I necessarily trust him. So, yeah, I mean, I think they have to just because of the things that we talked about before with Valanciunas. But I don't see a natural fit, like a 6-man that you bring off the bench. You're like, oh, yeah, he's a great stretch 4, or you have a 3 that is a little bit tougher that you can move up to 4. Like, I think this team actually lacks pure small forwards. So finding someone who can play bounce back and forth between the 3 and the 4, I want them to play a small ball lineup, but I don't know who it is that fills in.
It'll be CJ Miles. And I can only say that confidently.
At the 4?
I can only say that confidently because the Pacers did it to him all the time. He played a ton of minutes at the 4 for the Pacers over the last 2 years.
But that was with Paul George at the 3, who's way bigger than Norman Powell.
Correct, but Paul George still never guarded 4s. He would only guard 3s.
Okay.
Paul George refused to play against 4s. It was his pet peeve. But I wouldn't be surprised if they put out a lineup. Not saying that it's ideal, but Lowry, DeRozan, Norman Powell, and then you have C.J. Miles and Ibaka. I'm not saying that's a good lineup on the floor. There's no doubt in my mind that'll be out there.
I think you can get away with that against teams that don't have very good power forwards or someone who's going to, play a small ball 4, just hypothetically throwing them out there like a team like the Nets who play Rondé at the 4, something like that. But come playoff time, if it's a good 4, CJ Miles will get abused. But if it's not, they might be able to get away with it, and they'll have some really good spacing with a lineup of Lowry, DeRozan, Powell, Miles, and Ibaka, because Ibaka can still shoot. So,
you know what? I forgot about Anunoby, and if he is the player that people market him to be and he recovers from the knee injury, he's the kind of person up over 200 pounds, 230 pounds, 6'8", wide frame, long, a lot of length. He's someone that I could see filling that role. But as a rookie, I don't want him in an Eastern Conference semifinal, an Eastern Conference final in crunch time. I mean, he's got to be unbelievable to do that, and I just don't think it's in the cards for this year.
Exactly. I would have mentioned
he has the shooting, right? I don't even think he has the shooting to play like a consistent minutes at the stretch 4 position.
I would have mentioned him as well, Matt. Like you said, though, I think, being his rookie season, already being injured, maybe if he wasn't injured, he'd be able to kind of prove them that. But, and like Kory said, not necessarily be able to do much offensively. But I think they could probably get away with it, but you just don't want to play rookie big minutes unless they're, extremely good. But breakout starter for the Raptors next year, who's going to break out? This is a tough one, I think.
Yeah, I mean, whether he's a starter or not, I think Norman Powell is the natural choice for me. Terrence Ross is gone. Corey Joseph is gone. Damari Carroll is gone. The path is completely opened up for Powell, and I think that was intentional. He's become a very solid pick-and-roll player. He's a good finisher with a soft touch around the rim. He's already a pretty good secondary or tertiary ball handler if you want to use him in that way. He knows how to use screens advantageously. So between him, if he can fight off CJ Miles for all those minutes, I think between Powell's athleticism and his switchability, I really like his potential to break out, whether it's in a starting role or off the bench.
Yeah, I'm going easy with my choice. I'm picking DeRozan. I think there's more he can bring to his game. I mean, obviously, I don't know how many more points per game he can average, but I definitely think he can be more efficient. There have been a lot of talks from the guys I follow on Twitter and who are beat reporters for the Raptors that he's trying to add a 3-point shot to his game. If DeRozan adds even a subpar 3-point shot to his game, that is a filthy 2-guard in the NBA.
He'll be unstoppable. He'll be unstoppable if that happens.
He drives and gets to the line, and if he develops a 3-point shot, I mean, that guy could average probably right around 32 points per game. I wouldn't be shocked if he could. But that's my guy to break out.
Yeah, I think starter-wise, since I don't have Powell starting, I have Miles. I think DeRozan's kind of the only guy that I see really getting better. Like you said, Kory, adding the 3-point shot and then, being more of a ball handler, more a pick-and-roll player. He's supposed to get involved a little bit more passing this year. So I think DeRozan is kind of an easy bet, too, because he's been a guy, like I mentioned earlier on the pod, that does get better. But breakout bench player for the Raptors next year.
I don't think there is one other than Norman Powell, to be perfectly honest, but I'll make the argument for Pascal Siakam. He was completely thrown into the fire too early last season, started 38 games as a rookie. They realized that was not the best way to develop him. So he ended up playing in the G League playoffs for the Raptors G League team, and he won MVP of the G League playoffs. He brings a ton of energy, a lot of versatility to his defense, just really multifaceted defender overall. I think he can absorb some of the minutes lost from Valanciunas as they start to wane away from him. He's still someone, Siakam, who is really raw offensively. I don't know quite how that would fit with the team that's looking for more spacing. And then the other thing with him is he's already 22 years old. He's a very old sophomore. So if there's a breakout in him, it'll probably be this season or the next. But overall, I love Siakam's defensive activity.
Yeah, I feel like I'm staring at a bunch of dumpsters, and I'm trying to pick the best one to be
savage.
Yeah, I don't actually think Siakam's going to break out, like I said.
It's just tough. I mean, I didn't put CJ Miles in my starting lineup, so I guess I have myself an easy out. So screw you guys. So I'm gonna go with CJ Miles. CJ Miles within this offense is probably, besides Kyle Lowry, the best 3-point shooter,
hands down.
So I think off the bench, he's going to be their sixth man at this point in time. His usage is probably going to go back up. Last year it was under 20. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes back up to 22. They're going to rely on this guy to score more than 10 points per game. I wouldn't be surprised if he averages his career high, right around 13 or 14, because they're going to need someone to produce some offense off that bench unit.
Yeah. So I had obviously CJ Miles starting, so I'm going with Norman Powell. That's an easy choice for me. And, Matt hinted at it. They kind of let some of these guys go because they wanted to get Powell more minutes, and he's shown flashes. So I think it could be a really nice season for him. Let's talk wins. What's the best case scenario for the Raptors next season?
Okay, best case scenario. I think if everything falls their way, they could be a top 2 seed, somewhere in the mid-50s win total. I think there are still questions with Boston and Washington and Cleveland. None of those teams are sure things. I don't have Toronto in front of them now, but I think if things fall into place. And the way that happens is that they play a lot similarly the way they played the beginning of last season. They move the ball furiously. DeMar becomes the dazzling playmaker and facilitator that they think he can be. Ibaka proves that he can defend centers on a full-time basis. I still think in a best-case scenario they can win the Atlantic Division. Norman Powell becomes a third reliable star, takes like an Otto Porter type jump. I think that's their ceiling.
My best-case scenario is 51-31. That's them being the same team they were from last year with worse players than they have from last year. So that's my best case scenario.
I'm going to go with Matt. I think, mid-50s is a possibility. They'll have Serge for the whole season, and a lot of these other Eastern Conference teams are a lot of turnover where the Raptors have, a lot of the same guys in the starting lineup. Obviously, they have question marks with the bench, but there's going to be so many bad teams in the East, and I think the Raptors in the past have kind of proven they can beat some of these bad teams easily. So I think, like you guys mentioned, DeRozan having another big year and adding to his game, I think Raptors' best case, everybody's healthy, everything works out. These young guys kind of take another step. Like Matt said, maybe a 2 seed and 54 wins. Worst case scenario,
though. Like 43, 44 wins is worst case scenario for me if everyone stays healthy. I could see Lowry starting to age defensively. It doesn't take well to being moved to a spot up role. I don't believe that will happen because Lowry's a fantastic spot up shooter. I could see DeMar not being able to stretch it out to 3 and not hitting the ground running with the facilitation role that he's going to take on. Valanciunas becomes undeniably unplayable, not just like unplayable like we know he is. And I think that floor has them closer to Philadelphia in the Atlantic Division than it does to Boston, probably closer to a 7 or 8 seed.
Yeah, my worst case scenario for them is they get, 44, 45 wins. I think even if you fall off in the East, as long as you have 1 or 2 All-Stars, you're really not falling off that much in the standings. That's just how bad the East is at this point in time, as we've mentioned on almost every podcast around the Eastern Conference team. But yeah, I think worst case scenario, they fall off to like a 5 seed at best with, 45, 46 wins.
Yeah, I think worst for me would be 46. And, a lot of bad things could still happen, but they're a talented team. And like you mentioned, and Matt, you mentioned, the East is pretty bad. So I think 5th seed's probably worst case because, you have, Cleveland, Boston, Washington, Milwaukee. I don't know of another team in the East I'm willing to bet can jump them, even if things don't go right.
They're still a fabulous regular season team to me. The question for them is, how do they translate it to the playoffs? Is Dwayne Casey going to be forward thinking enough to get them in situations where he's really maximizing the talent? Because to me, they're still a regular season juggernaut.
Yeah, very true. And that, worst case scenario, we didn't even mention playoffs is, getting knocked out in the first round, which could be possible if they ended up with a 5th seed, matching up with a team like Milwaukee, who did give them a little trouble last year, and they're going to obviously be better. But realistically, what's going to happen for Toronto next year?
I just want to say one more thing, Nick, on the issues with, being a regular season team. Last year, Kyle Lowry was in the top, 5 players, I believe, in minutes per game with 37.4. And losing a guy like Kory Joseph, that doesn't really help those numbers to go down anywheres. And like we mentioned, this team is more of a regular season team. I just see the same scenario playing out with a guy like Kyle Lowry burning himself out in the regular season. Yeah. There's no one really back him up.
They should be managing his minutes. I mean, he's on the wrong side of 30 now. He's an undersized guard. But you look at their depth chart with DeLon Wright, I don't know if there's an opportunity really for Lowry to really decrease his minutes.
Yeah, very true. I think that could be, the lack of depth. You think they'd maybe go out and sign a cheap guy, a veteran that could just kind of come in and, even just give him a couple minutes extra off a game that can kind of run the show. And that way you don't necessarily always have to count on a young guy. But that could be an issue. But realistically, what do we expect from the Raptors next year?
I have them at 49 wins, 4th place in the East going into the playoffs. So that's 2 wins less than last season. I just think the addition of CJ Miles, sorry, Kory, doesn't make up for the losses of Joseph, Patterson, Tucker, and Carroll combined, because I still think DeMarre Carroll is a rotational piece. And the Raptors, to me, just feel very top-heavy, and I'm just not sure that they can replace the depth that they had last season. I'm not really confident in that. I am really excited to see DeMar DeRozan as the primary facilitator. I think Toronto has realized that DeRozan is their best player. He can be their best playmaker, and that in order for them to move the ball at a rapid pace, they need to get into his hands, because he has so much more length than Kyle Lowry, and Kyle Lowry is a better three-point shooter off the ball. And then my bold actual prediction is I think DeMar DeRozan wins the scoring title this year. The ball is going to be in his hands. I think the guys who were in front of him last season scoring-wise, Isaiah Thomas, Russell Westbrook, James Harden, guys like that, they will have more mouths to feed in those respective places. So I think this is the season for DeRozan. I know you guys chose him as your breakout starter player. So I have him winning the scoring title, all NBA again. This team is clearly his now.
That's a good hot take. I'll take that every day on Sunday. That's a good take. I wouldn't be surprised, now that you mentioned DeRozan possibly, being the scoring title champ. Like you mentioned, there's so many superstars and all-stars have teamed up this offseason. That's a really good take. I'm rolling with one more win than you did, Matt. I'm saying the Raptors win 49 games. They finish, either the 3rd seed or the 4th seed. They're going to be battling with Washington. I think the Bucks are just, a couple steps down behind those two teams. But, this is a team that's still going to be top-heavy, like you mentioned. Doing this podcast, I actually lost more faith in them than I had prior, just because looking at this bench unit, it's a dumpster fire. It's not good. Adding CJ Miles helps, but it doesn't move the meter when you lose, 3 other key role players. I'm worried about Larry being able to stay healthy. And, DeRozan usage rate last year was already 34.3%. I don't know how much higher that can get. I mean, if that kid develops a three-point shot, then, DeRozan, like you said, could be the scoring title champ.
Yeah, I agree with Kory. I like that take, Matt. I think, like you mentioned, the other big names are kind of going to lose some of that. And kind of what we talked about before, Lowry's going to kind of take a step back, and they're going to try to limit his minutes and his role a little bit more. So DeRozan's going to have the keys to the offense. It's going to be a lot on him. And I have them probably around 48 to 50 wins. And, their bench still isn't good, but they're going to get away with it just because of the talent in the Eastern Conference. What do you think is a successful season for the Raptors in terms of the playoffs? An Eastern Conference Finals appearance, pushing that team to 7 games. What do you think is considered a successful season for the Raptors next year?
Eastern Conference Finals, to me, if they get past Cleveland or Boston and they can win 2 playoff series, I think that will be an overall success for them, given where they are. I think expectations should not be to get that far. I think they're going to have their hands full with the Bucks if they have that same first-round matchup and Jabari's back. So if they can put it all together, I think a successful season for them is, regardless of where they're seeded going into the playoffs, making it back to the Eastern Conference Finals.
Yeah, anything less than an Eastern Conference Finals appearance is a failure for this team. And that's just because of where they've been at already and where they're at in terms of, Kyle Lowry's age and Ibaka's age. Those guys coming off the huge contracts or, getting the huge contracts. If they get into the finals, it's not happening. But if they get into the finals, that's just like the entire North erupts and they'll probably secede from Canada and become their own, island. But, yeah, I think best case for them would be if they made the Eastern Conference Finals. You got to get past the second round.
Yeah, I think that would be success. Like you guys said, getting to the second round, I think they'd have to get extremely lucky to go to the finals. Just a million things would have to kind of fall the right way, and it would have to be injuries because they don't have necessarily a deep team. But I think, if they could somehow get lucky and maybe avoid the Cavs and maybe try and avoid Boston, I don't know how that would happen, but that's kind of what the Raptors are hoping for. Because obviously, even if they got to the finals, I think the Warriors would make quick work of them.
The Warriors are going to make quick work of everyone.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
I mean, Cleveland was the only team that had a chance, and I just thought their offseason, they did not build to beat the Warriors. They just built to continue to be the Cavs.
Pretty much.
But
I agree
that's
with
for
that.
that's for another day.
Yeah, exactly. But let's talk the truth. Honestly, had a hard time kind of coming up with the emoji for the Raptors, but I just went with an easy one on this team. I went with the hospital emoji just because, Lowry's health is going to be such a big part of this team. If they lose him, like we mentioned, the point guard depth is just not there.
I went with the recycle emoji because this team, to me, is just running the same core back, just recycling the same people over and over. I realized that the scheme is going to be different than it was last year, and they have some young players off the bench that are really promising, some good developmental players that I like. But to me, this is the same core, and they're just running it back another time. And there's nothing wrong with that. As I mentioned before, there's nothing wrong with being competitive, selling out every single game, and giving it a good shot and hoping that Boston or Cleveland falters in some unforeseen way. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that to me for Toronto.
Cue the villain music. I'm back with another mean emoji. I'm picking the clown. I'm picking the clown. You guys can probably already guess. The Raptors every year, they play fantastic in the regular season. They go into the playoffs. We're thinking maybe this is the team that can dethrone LeBron. So they're a bunch of clowns. maybe it's a little bit extreme, but when it comes to the playoffs, the Raptors just aren't as good as they are in the regular season. They never translate over once it hits April.
Yeah.
End of.
And especially last season, I think last year there was the most hype, especially they got Ibaka. They got PJ Tucker, the quote-unquote LeBron stopper. And, things were looking pretty good, and maybe the Cavs defense was pretty bad, and maybe they could get lucky, but that just wasn't the case. And I think, your emoji was great too, Matt. They're kind of just recycling it. But I guess, from Toronto perspective, winning 50 games just isn't a bad thing. So I think you just can't really throw out this team. So you just got to keep recycling it until maybe you get lucky or something. It's just a bad time to be in the East with LeBron, and then in the West you got the Warriors. Just a tough time to win in the NBA. But let's talk league pass.
They won't ever get star power. There's never going to be a superstar who goes, I want to go play with DeRozan or Lowry. Just not at this point.
What's the best trade package they could throw out there? What do you think they could do to maybe try to get a good player and they go on the market? What's the best deal you think they could throw?
I mean, they're capped out. So unless someone is going to take Valanciunas' contract, and I had a conversation with a close friend about a Valanciunas for Tristan Thompson swap, which is, it doesn't really, it makes things interesting, but I don't see them adding another superstar given their salary cap threshold and where they're trying to be financially, not paying into the luxury tax. So in order to get someone who's, making close to the max, who is a max player, it's going to have to cost more draft picks, and they've already sent their 2018 draft picks to Brooklyn, and then either Valanciunas or Ibaka, who are not the most appetizing contracts, in my opinion.
Well,
now, there's no deal this team could make because you'd have to move. The only person who's got a lot of value at this point is DeRozan, and you're not going to move DeRozan just to get another superstar. Like you said, Matt, the contrast between Ibaka and Valanciunas aren't that appetizing. And then, Kyle Lowry's on the wrong side of 30 with a huge contract as well.
It might be like a trade deadline thing. I think, like what if it goes completely south in New Orleans, and New Orleans is trying to ship off DeMarcus Cousins.
That's what I was thinking.
Before he becomes a free agent, then you pay lower than market value for the production that DeMarcus Cousins might give you, and you ship off a Norman Powell or Siakam, someone, or Jakob Hurtle, someone who has some promise still, and that you can appease New Orleans for a little bit. But I think maybe that's feasible, I guess.
But the problem with that is probably New Orleans would get a better offer elsewhere.
Yeah.
I think maybe what they probably will try to do at the deadline is maybe add some bench depth. I don't know, maybe trade a future pick or something, but they're going to obviously, if they want to be any type of playoff team, they probably need to add at least another veteran to that bench, maybe a backup point guard. We'll see what happens with DeLon Wright, but let's talk League Pass. 1 through 10, what do you got the Raptors?
So this is interesting to me because I don't know how much to buy into the whole, oh, DeMar's going to shoot a lot of threes now, and DeMar's going to become a facilitator, and we're going to space the floor and move the ball and shift the opposing defense from place to place, because that's the narrative that's coming out of the Toronto camp. If that is true, then I think they're very interesting. I would put them at like maybe a 6 or a 7. But if they go back to the old isolation first, your turn for pick and roll, my turn for pick and roll, Toronto, I don't really need to see that. That would knock them down a peg for me. So overall, I think they're a good league pass rating team because I love watching DeMar DeRozan. I think he has such a polished offensive game from 15 feet and in, and just his ability to fake people out and get to the cup at will. That alone, plus a really good playing environment up in Toronto, is enough to get them to like a 5 for me. But if they change their scheme up and they try to go a little bit more modern, then I think they're pretty interesting.
Damn you, because I wanted to be the lowest, so I was hoping you guys were going to go a little bit higher. I'm rolling with 5. I think DeRozan and Lowry, they do enough to make them a little bit interesting. And also we haven't really much. Ibaka only played like 25 games last year for them, so we really didn't get to see Ibaka become,
Good point.
within the offense. So I'm not even sure we saw the best Serge Ibaka last year. We're probably going to, try and work him into the offense more. Because, as a third option, I think Ibaka would be perfect alongside DeRozan and Lowry. And then Valanciunas as a fourth option makes that team a little bit, more enticing offensively.
And Lowry only had. And I was sorry to interrupt. I was just saying Lowry only had a couple games to mesh with Ibaka in the regular season before they hit the playoffs. So that is pretty meaningful too.
Yeah, they were never really fully healthy together. So that could be a plus for Toronto, seeing a Serge, DeRozan, and Lowry all healthy at the same time, kind of clicking thing. They'll have a full season to work it out. It's a pretty good 3-man combo. For me, league pass-wise, though, I'm going to go with a 6 out of 10 because like Matt said, maybe they'll change their offense, maybe they won't. They have enough star power with Lowry and DeRozan that you want to check it out, and Ibaka kind of puts up big games sometimes. And FanDuel-wise, they got some guys that you might take a chance on, especially some of the young guys, but nothing crazy, but not too bad either. You'd watch a Toronto Raptors over what TV show that you like?
All right, so so this is with the caveat that they run the new system that I was talking about before, and they try to become more modern, because if not, then I think they're super boring. So if they run the new system, I would watch it over The Office, which is one of my favorite shows of all time. But the reason is I've seen The Office in every single episode like at least 7 or 8 times. Like I've rolled through that on Netflix so many times that the excitement that I would get of watching the Raptors try to incorporate a new system with DeMar launching threes is more interesting to me than watching The Office for like the double digit, 10th or 11th time. But I still love The Office a lot. And I would absolutely watch The Office before I ever watched Toronto run the same offense that they've been running.
Wow. That was the first time The Office was mentioned. Well, you mentioned it last time, didn't you, Nick?
Yeah, I mentioned it a long time ago, I think.
Okay.
All right. Well, this is tough for me. I'm out of shows that I don't despise at this point. But I'm gonna pick a weird one. I'm gonna pick Dragon Ball Z.
Damn, Kory, that's terrible. That's terrible.
I haven't watched Dragon Ball Z Super yet. Like I haven't even seen one episode, so up or anything. But at this point in my life, I would rather watch NBA basketball almost over any cartoon anime show there is for the most part. And a show like Dragon Ball Z, like it was badass when I was a kid. I still think it's badass because like there's still a little kid in me, but it's just not as interesting to me.
Damn, throw some respect on Dragon Ball Z. I wish Jack was here to help me back this up. I'm kind of disappointed in you. Kind of throwing shade at a lot of shows that I like. But I'm going to go with a show that like I think is funny, but it's not a huge deal to me, and that's Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It's bad acting, but they have some funny scenes. Nothing crazy, but the Raptors aren't a team that I'm going to, flick on every night. I'll watch enough, I watch a lot of Atlantic Division like Matt mentioned. He does too. Every time they play the Nets, I might see him live. I've seen the Raptors play actually. I might have seen the Raptors play more than any other professional NBA team, not being the Nets.
Interesting.
Because I've seen 2 playoff games against the Raptors because they faced them when they're in Brooklyn, then right before they were leaving New Jersey. So, and both times the Nets won. Just throw it out there.
Before the Lowry DeRozan days, though, I don't know how much Toronto you were watching live. That must have been pretty ugly, unless you were watching all the way back in like the McGrady Carter days.
It was when Chris Bosh was really good, and the Nets had Vince Carter, Richard Jefferson, Jason Kidd, and it was like a 30-point blowout.
All right.
It was in a playoff game, and then obviously, in Brooklyn when they had KG and Pierce for that one season together. I was at one of those games. I was at the game when KG did the jersey pop, and the fans went crazy.
Oh yeah.
So that was probably the best moment for the Nets in Paul Pierce and KG and the Nets tenure was that Raptors series. But that's for another day. Thank you guys for listening, and as always, thank you Kory, thank you Matt for hopping on. Great show, and then we're moving on to number 8.
Nick, Kory, it's been real. Catch you guys for the next one.
Let's hold on. We're going home. The last one.
That was good.